In the sweltering fever-dream autumn of 1851, the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans was the gilded heart of a dark empire. Under its soaring rotunda, amidst the thick haze of expensive cigars and the heavy scent of river mud, fortunes were traded with the flick of a wrist. But that year, a mystery took root there, one that historians still only dare to whisper about. A woman, known to the ledgers only as Amara, was placed upon the auction block. She was beautiful, yes, but witnesses described her beauty as unearthly, possessing a gaze so piercing it could silence a room full of the South's most ruthless sugar barons. Yet, if you go into the climate-controlled vaults today and open the heavy, leather-bound ledger of human property, Volume 4, you will find a record that science cannot explain. Amara was sold and returned 12 times in just 6 months. 12 buyers, 12 astronomical prices, and 12 men who returned her within days, shaken pale and terrified to speak of what had happened behind their closed doors. Tonight, we open the Red Ledger to expose the truth behind the most impossible sale in Louisiana history. This is not just a story of the Antebellum South. It is a chronicle of a moral haunting, a reckoning that proved some secrets are too dangerous to keep, and some souls are far too powerful to ever be owned. The legend of Amara begins not with a ghost story, but with a chilling distortion of the American ledger. In the autumn of 1851, the St. Louis Hotel stood as the epicenter of New Orleans' high-stakes human commerce. While the auction block was a place of cold calculation, Lot 402 introduced a variable that defied every law of the market. Historians peering back at the Red Ledger find themselves staring into a void of traditional economic logic. This single woman was sold 12 times in 6 months, a frequency of turnover that should have signaled a complete loss of value. Instead, the archives reveal a perverse inversion where her price climbed higher with every terrified return. The sheer statistical impossibility of these transactions suggests a breakdown in the very machinery of the Antebellum South. Usually, a returned individual was labeled as defective, their price plummeting as word of their perceived flaws spread through the city. Yet, the traders in the rotunda seemed possessed by a competitive hysteria that only intensified as the mystery deepened. They watched as the wealthiest families in the state willingly forfeited thousands of dollars just to remove her. Each buyer was a man of supposed rational business sense, yet they acted like gamblers chasing a ruinous hand. The ledger became a record of a psychological contagion that infected the city's most powerful elite. Looking closer at the ink-stained pages of Volume 4, one sees the physical evidence of the auctioneer's growing internal panic. Jean-Baptiste Muir was a man who prided himself on the clinical precision of his bookkeeping and descriptions. However, as the months progressed, his entries regarding Amara became erratic, marked by ink blots and frantic, jagged script. He struggled to categorize a commodity that refused to behave like an object, yet fetched prices that mocked the standard rates. The ledger no longer tracked a person's labor potential, but rather the cost of a society's desperate hubris. Muir's struggle was the first sign that the ritual of the auction was beginning to unravel. The environment of the St. Louis Hotel provided a stark, gilded backdrop for this unprecedented sequence of financial failures. Underneath the grand dome, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and tobacco, men traded lives. They were blinded by Amara's aesthetic value, viewing her as the ultimate status symbol, to be displayed in their homes. They ignored the fact that she stood with a terrifying stillness that silenced the rowdy crowd of cotton kings. This was a world built on the absolute control of property, yet here was property that exerted control. The buyers were not merely purchasing a servant, They were unknowingly buying the instrument of their own social execution. This economic anomaly served as a precursor to the total moral collapse that was about to sweep through Louisiana. Each transaction was a desperate attempt by the patriarchy to prove that their wealth could insulate them from the truth. They believed that by paying a higher price, they could dominate the mirror and force it to reflect only their glory. Instead, the red ledger became a catalogue of vanity, tracking the exact dollar amount each man paid for his ruin. The 12 sales represent a frantic, half-year struggle to maintain a system of lies that Amara's presence made impossible. By the time the final sale was recorded, the ledger had become a death warrant for the old order. The medical and psychological enigma of Amara's presence found its most chilling documentation in the private casebook of Dr. Julian Fourier. A man of cold science and rigid logic, Fourier sought to strip away the supernatural rumors and apply the principles of clinical observation. He moved beyond the whispers of witchcraft to propose a theory that was far more terrifying to the Louisiana elite. Amara, he posited, was not a source of active malice but a passive, biological mirror of the human soul. She did not possess the secrets of her owners through any occult ritual or spoken word. Instead, she acted as a high-frequency conductor for the repressed physiological stress of those who lived in her proximity. This mirror theory suggested that the human conscience emits a physical frequency that most are too dull to perceive. Fourier noted that every master of a household carries the heavy weight of his unpunished crimes and buried shames. These secrets create a psychological void, a point of immense tension that Amara seemed naturally drawn toward. When she stood in a hallway or stared at a specific floorboard, she was simply resonating with the static of a hidden truth. She was a biological divining rod, compelled by her own nervous system to point at the rot. The horror she caused was not of her own making, but a reflection of the darkness she encountered. The physical sensations reported by those who came into contact with her further supported Fourier's radical hypothesis of a resonant empathy. He recorded that upon touching her skin, he experienced a sudden drop in temperature and a jarring sense of vertigo. It was as if her body functioned as a vacuum, drawing out the hidden anxieties of anyone standing within her reach. The owners did not fear her because she was a threat, but because she made it impossible to lie. In her presence, the carefully constructed facades of Southern gentlemanly honor began to vibrate and crack under the pressure. She forced the subconscious to the surface, making the invisible weight of guilt physically unbearable for the wicked. Fourier's notes describe a phenomenon he called moral collapse, where the physical health of the owners deteriorated as their secrets surfaced. He watched as powerful men suffered from acute insomnia and violent tremors, unable to endure the silence of her gaze. They felt a psychic nakedness whenever she entered a room, as if she were reading the very ink of their souls. This was not a curse in the traditional sense, but a forced transparency that the aristocratic society could not survive. The doctor realized that the institution of slavery relied on the absolute silence and invisibility of the truth. Amara was the biological antithesis of that silence, a living entity that made concealment an impossibility. Ultimately, the mirror theory explains why Amara appeared to grow stronger and more luminous with every household she dismantled. She was not sustained by the meager rations of the auction house, but by the energy of the revelations she triggered. As the lies of the Louisiana elite were stripped away, she seemed to absorb the liberated truth like a form of nourishment. Fourier's final warning to the auctioneer was that a person who is a mirror cannot be possessed. To attempt to own her was to attempt to own one's own judgment, a feat that would always end in madness. She remained a weaponized form of empathy, a being whose only purpose was to reflect the light of truth. The domestic collapse of Louisiana's most fortified dynasties began the moment Amara crossed their thresholds, acting as a catalyst for total social ruin. Henry Duguay, the first to fall, discovered that his immense wealth offered no protection against the silent interrogation of her gaze. By simply staring at a sealed nursery wall, Amara forced a revelation that stripped away Duguay's carefully cultivated image of a devoted family man. The discovery of his hidden second family was not a result of her speaking, but of the house itself yielding its secrets. In a matter of days, the cotton magnate went from a pillar of society to a disgraced outcast. The ledger's brief note of his financial loss was merely a shadow of his absolute moral bankruptcy. The destruction moved upriver to the estate of Louis Fontino, where the air grew heavy with the scent of unpunished crimes. Fontino was a man of cold, rational order who believed his iron-fisted control could suppress any lingering ghosts of his past. Yet, Amara's fixation on a patch of earth beneath an ancient oak tree drove his household into a state of hysterical compulsion. When the ground was finally breached, the skeletal remains of an infant wrapped in the family crest were pulled from the dark soil. This was the physical manifestation of a sin Fontino had buried years prior to protect his political standing. The dynasty shattered instantly, leaving a man of science paralyzed by the undeniable weight of his own shadow. Judge Etienne Lalère represented the third, and perhaps most systemic collapse, as Amara targeted the very foundation of legal authority. The judge believed his life was a temple of rectitude, yet he held a secret that threatened the entire Lalère legacy. Amara's presence in his study, her eyes locked onto his heavy iron safe, created a tension that his own son could not ignore. The safe contained a forged will, a document of theft that had diverted a fortune into the judge's grasping hands. When the paper was brought into the light, the legal fiction of his life was incinerated by the truth. Lalère did not return Amara with a refund request. He fled the city entirely broken by her silence. As the winter of 1851 deepened, the pattern of domestic ruin expanded from individual scandals into a wider contagion of social decay. Shipping magnates and timber barons found their empires collapsing as hidden gambling debts and illegal contracts were suddenly, inexplicably brought to light. Each household followed the same haunting rhythm: the silence of the woman, the growing mania of the master, and the final, explosive revelation. The social fabric of the elite began to fray as the foundational trust between husbands and wives evaporated in the heat. It became clear that no parlor was grand enough to hide a secret once Amara stood within its walls. These were not just failed business transactions, but the systematic dismantling of a class built on a foundation of lies. The cumulative effect of these collapses turned the grand estates of Louisiana into monuments of paranoia and visible, shivering fear. Men who once commanded thousands of souls now trembled at the thought of a single woman standing in their hallways. The domestic sphere, once a sanctuary of polite concealment, had been transformed into a courtroom where the evidence was always hidden in plain sight. Amara never raised a hand or spoke an accusation, yet she left a trail of ruined marriages and vacated mansions in her wake. She proved that the domestic peace of the South was a fragile illusion that relied on the darkness to survive. By the time she reached her 12th sale, the very concept of the Southern household had been irrevocably compromised. Beyond the ledgers of men, a secondary and more potent power structure began to emerge within the shadows of the grand estates. The women of the Louisiana elite, trapped in gilded cages of silence, found in Amara a terrifying but necessary ally. While the patriarchs viewed her as a curse, their wives began to see her as a key to the locked doors of their own lives. A whisper network of correspondence spread through the parishes, as sisters and cousins traded stories of the truth-teller. With a desperate, hungry awe, they were no longer content with the polite fictions of their marriages and began to crave the clarity her presence provided. This was a domestic insurgency, where the pursuit of truth became a radical act of defiance against the masters. The enslaved population of these households formed the most vital link in this silent coalition of the oppressed. The cooks, maids, and stable hands had long been the silent witnesses to the atrocities and indiscretions of the white aristocracy. They possessed the knowledge of the buried bodies and the hidden letters, but lacked the social standing to bring them to light. Amara became their avatar, a vessel through which their collective observations could finally be weaponized against their captors. When Amara would fix her gaze upon a specific floorboard, the house servants ensured the mistress was led into the room at the precise moment. It was a coordinated, wordless strike against the architecture of the plantation, using the master's own purchase as the tool. This fracture deepened along racial and gender lines, creating a climate of suspicion that paralyzed the social season of 1851. Traditional balls and dinner parties were abandoned as husbands began to view their own wives as potential spies and enemies. The foundational trust of the patriarchy was crumbling because the women were no longer willing to look away from the darkness. Every glance shared between a mistress and a servant over the silent figure of Amara felt like a conspiratorial vow. The men found themselves isolated within their own homes, surrounded by people who were waiting for their masks to slip. The power of the truth-teller had successfully turned the domestic sanctuary into a psychological battlefield for the elite. The spiritual authority of the era was equally unable to contain the spreading influence of this quiet and devastating rebellion. Preachers in the local churches railed against the spirit of discord and the demon of curiosity, but their sermons fell on deaf ears. The pews were filled with women who had seen the physical evidence of their husbands' sins and could no longer be pacified. One prominent banker's wife famously walked out of a Sunday service after Amara exposed her husband's theft of church funds. Her public departure signaled a total rejection of the social contract that had long protected the reputations of powerful men. The church, which had sanctioned the system of slavery, now found its own moral credibility being eroded by the truth. By the end of the year, the legacy of Amara's residency in these homes had created a permanent shift in the social landscape. Even after she was removed from her property, the blindfold could not be retied, and the culture of scrutiny remained. The women of Louisiana had learned that the secrets of the patriarchy were not invincible, and the truth was worth the cost of ruin. The silent rebellion had proven that the master's house was built on a foundation of sand that could be washed away by a single gaze. Amara had sparked a fire of transparency that continued to burn long after the Red Ledger recorded her final sale. This was the moment the oppressed realized that their collective silence was the only thing keeping the empire standing. The arrival of Senator Leonidas Thorne in New Orleans marked the final, explosive chapter in the history of the Red Ledger. As the Lion of Certain, Landry, Thorne was a man whose political power was matched only by his absolute, unwavering arrogance. He did not view Amara as a spiritual threat or a mysterious mirror, but as a personal challenge to his authority. On December 20, 1851, he stood in the rotunda and paid the unprecedented sum of $8,000 to claim her. His goal was not to utilize her labor, but to publicly break the legend that had terrified his peers. He intended to prove that the will of a master could dominate any truth. Thorne's mansion became the final arena for a battle between a man's pride and a woman's devastating silence. He immediately subjected Amara to a regime of menial, degrading toil, hoping to reduce her from an omen to a servant. Yet, the atmosphere of his estate shifted instantly, becoming thick with a suffocating, electrical tension that no order could dispel. Amara did not scrub the floors or tend the hearth as he commanded. She stood like a statue of judgment in his private library. Her eyes were locked onto a collection of antique floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that housed his most prestigious law volumes. The senator's bravado began to wither as the house servants watched his hands start to shake with an uncontrollable, rhythmic palsy. The climax occurred on a night when a violent winter storm lashed the bayou, echoing the turmoil within the house. Driven by a frantic, jagged desperation, Thorne began to tear the heavy mahogany shelves from the library walls with his own hands. Behind the leather-bound books of law, he found the hidden cavity containing the evidence of his greatest and most blood-stained crime. There lay the original land deeds and the proof of a systematic massacre he had orchestrated to seize his vast plantation. The documents were a death warrant for his political career and a direct link to the bodies he had buried. Amara stood in the doorway, a silent witness as the senator's life's work collapsed into a pile of rotting paper. The fallout was a cataclysmic event that finally silenced the Lion of Seine, Landry, and ended the cycle of the ledger. Thorne did not return Amara to the auction block. Instead, he was found the next morning in a state of total catatonic shock. The evidence of his atrocities was scattered across the floor, impossible to hide and too horrific for even his powerful allies to ignore. His reputation, built on decades of ruthless manipulation and legal theft, was obliterated in a single evening of forced revelation. The senator was eventually committed to an asylum, where he reportedly spent his final days screaming at the shadows. The legend he sought to kill had instead consumed him, proving that the truth is a debt that always collects. Amara's final entry in the Red Ledger is a haunting blank space that suggests she finally transcended the system of property. Following the ruin of Senator Thorne, she disappeared from the official records of Louisiana, as if she had simply dissolved into the humid air. Some claimed she escaped to the north, while others believed she was a vengeful spirit who returned to the bayou once her work was done. Her legacy remained in the 12 ruined dynasties she left behind, and the permanent fracture she caused in the southern social order. The Red Ledger was sealed shortly after, a heavy volume of sin that no auctioneer would ever dare to open again. She proved that while a body can be bought, the conscience remains a force that can never be shackled.